the question around women's job opportunities, women's labor force participation. And this very closely relates to the first one, but we're still figuring out exactly how. This is a very important point for the SDGs. I think in my tweet this morning, you know what tweets are like, you would write them off, and it's like, I don't think we're making sufficient progress on SDG 5. And this is the reason why. First, if you look at you probably can't see it properly, but the graph on the bottom right, this shows that there continues to be enormous differences in women's labor force participation across regions. These are not coming together. The divergence is not reducing. So you have contexts where in countries or regions that had high labor force participation, this is stagnating. Where they were low, it's stagnating as well. And in South Asia, it's even decreasing. Officially recorded female labor force participation in South Asia has gone down. This is a clear, I don't know what this figures mean exactly, we need to do more. The second, if you look at the graph on the top, and this is pure for illustrative purposes, there we simply plotted the labor force participation for countries at different levels of GDP. And there you see, and the EU hypothesis has not been confirmed, but what you see very clearly is that in countries with higher GDP, labor force participation is lower, and that is more the case for women. And this, for me, is like the big question where we need to do much more research. An additional point to make, and a lot of this work comes out from the work of both from the Urban Institute and by Professor Klaassen at Göttingen University. On top of those differences between men and women, a very important point is the segmentation in the labor force. Occupational, sectoral segregation is also not decreasing. As Stefan Klaassen would say, even in Sweden, women work in the most gender equal country in the world, one of the most gender equal countries. Even in Sweden, the women work in different jobs than men. And that in itself might not be a problem if those jobs were equally rewarding, but certainly in low-income contexts, we do know that women are and continue to be stuck in the least rewarding, the least, as you pointed out, in the least secure jobs. And what we see with those trends, and again, this is just illustration, is that those trends are actually not improving. With all the concerns about, and this is it's not only the case that women find less opportunity, we also know that the unemployment among young men is increasing. In some of the cases where women have gained, it is actually, as men are losing, with some of the feminist economists in the US have called it gender conflicted. The overall issue of employment creation is by itself an important one. And what the research suggests is that it's particularly important to see for
I've got a million questions about that, but I'm going to hold off. I want to give other speakers, but just the issue of women's experience as the economy is turned down as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Implicit in a lot of what you've said, Ariane, is this idea that social norms constrain a lot of what's going on. So one of the reasons I'm glad that Fauzi is here is Pakistan is a place where we assume that social norms are a huge challenge, but there's a lot of development going on. So Fauzi, if you could tell us first of all some facts, what's going on in Pakistan, but then a little bit about your program, which I view as innovative. I don't understand quite why the Punjab government set up a whole new commission. Please.
Okay. So, to begin with, thank you very much for this opportunity to be here and talk about some of the things which are present in Pakistan and what's happening to improve women's situation. Much of what Ariane was talking about is true to Pakistan. So in our experience also, the burden of the care economy, keeping women back, cultural Pakistan's total population is 208 million as the recent census has returned. And by virtue of being 55% of the population, whatever is done in Pakistan, Punjab becomes important to Pakistan. So whatever I say, I guess, can be applied, except for extreme cultural differences to other provinces. So we do have this literacy gap. There is gender gap in enrollment also. 5% for Pakistan, 2% for Punjab, and here is my opportunity to talk about what is being done to reduce the gender gap over here. In terms of key development indicators, Pakistan has a significant gap in terms of the labor force, as you see, 69% for men and 28% at home. Actually, it's the other way around. It's flipped. It's 22% for women in Pakistan and 28% in Punjab. Sorry for the wrong slide. And then again, we see that there's a big urban-rural difference over here, because in the urban participation of women really exceeds, the rural really exceeds the urban participation. Urban is only at 13%, which points to a very significant issue, which is why literate women are not transitioning into employment. And we see that only about 3.7% of the labor force is women labor force is literate. So here is where your culture, we feel, is primarily playing up. Well, actually, it's 3.7, close to 3.7 in Punjab, but 2.6% in Pakistan, which is extremely low. We also see that sector-wise employment is higher in agriculture and pretty low in non-agricultural sectors. In terms of the ownership of physical resources again, and I guess understandably we see that there is a disparity between men and women's ownership of land. But this, I find, is again an unrepresentative number, because of the fact that close to 20% women who do own land are primarily in rural areas, and by virtue of inheritance and all, land does pass to women. However, the control of land remains significantly low as compared to the ownership. The bank accounts held by women, I feel, is a little more representative. I mean, you see that, I can't see very well, but I think that it stands at about close to 20%. Yeah, the percentage is not given, but close to 20% of the bank accounts that we recently looked at, in a government bank incidentally, they belong to women. And that, here's a story which I should have come to later, but we started to collect data just recently on the number of bank accounts held by women. And we found out that this particular bank that we took data from had about 14% ownership of accounts by women. And the next year when we collect, because we do an annual analysis of data, so the next year when we collected data from women, it shot up to over 21% or so. And I frankly did not believe it, or I was skeptical, I should say I was skeptical. So we went back to them and said, what's happening here? You know, are you fudging your numbers? And we found out that that wasn't the case. They had just, by looking at the data, they had realized how poorly they were doing. And then they started particular interventions to get more women account holders. And since they do have leverage, because it is a government bank and it's easier to get salary accounts, they were able to get more accounts, and it shot up to over 21%. The size of land and the volume of accounts are two other indicators that tell us where women stand. Because in terms of the size of the land, you will see that men have about 2.5 times larger size of the land holdings that they have as compared to women. Even in terms of bank accounts, we found that the volume of accounts stood at about 7% for women, even though they now have about 22% accounts in this particular bank, but the volume of accounts is very low. The loans that are given to women just stand at around 5% also. And the good figures that you're seeing over here, the microfinance figures, yes, here women have almost parity in terms of the micro loans that they get. But micro loans really don't lead to tremendous economic development, as we all know. I guess this slide just tells you about transition into the labor force. We found out that only about 30% of less than 30% of the women who graduate from universities join the workforce, especially for medical graduates. This has been one of our challenges, that medical graduates have not been able to transition into the workforce. So that's all the bad news. I should probably come to the better news now. After this recognition, and after we've seen tremendous disparities in terms of CNICs, voter registration, in every walk of life, it leads to women's economic empowerment, I feel. Lots of measures were taken, including the formation of our own commission. And this is an institution which has to be established in all the provinces of Pakistan. 3 of the provinces do have these commissions, 1 does not have at the moment, but it is underway. Punjab is large, so we're trying to do much more, since we do impact 55% of the women over there. And some of the things that we have done is, and I want to go to your comment where you said there was belief but no evidence. I think it really depicts what I also felt, because we all knew that women were not doing so well, but where's the evidence? And we found out that there was very little evidence. Most of the evidence came out from NGO data or surveys which were discarded as unrepresentative. So one of the first orders of the day for the Commission was to generate that evidence, to convince the government from inside the government that women are not doing well in many of the areas. And we went on to make, establish this first ever, I would say, gender management information system, which is an open to public database. It has over 300 indicators where the disaggregation is of course by gender, but also in some certain cases by rural-urban divide. And that gives us a picture in about 7 areas as to where women stand. Starting from demography, which tells us that, incidentally, Pakistan is 49% women and 51% men, which is different from most of the other parts of the world. But it also tells you about the CNI, the National Identity Card Registration, where there is about 12 million gap between men and women, unfortunately, but decreasing. In terms of education, we have rich data on where women stand, but you'll see that there's a justice sector here. And the justice sector captures violence against women, and how violence against women impacts economic empowerment, and how, vice versa, also how economic disempowerment leads to greater violence against women. This is telling us a lot of stories, because it is also uncovering how poorly equipped state institutions can be for addressing violence against women, and which is reflected in the fact that there are just about 2% women police officers in the police. But there is a move to increase that, and even in the judiciary, which now stands at about 25% women judges. I think this is better than the United States, perhaps. but
I don't know.
But just by virtue of capturing this evidence and analyzing it and presenting it to policymakers, a lot of development has happened. I should probably stop here, and we can talk a little bit more about what is being done to ameliorate Pakistan. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, again, I have lots of questions. I'm sure the audience does as well. Francisco, you led the World Bank's World Development Report on inequality, as I recollect, a while back. But in stuff you've done since, you distinguished between inequality of due to circumstance and inequality due to choices. I don't know if that's the right framework. That strikes me as fitting into this framework we were talking about. Can you reflect from your perspective on the issues we were talking about?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. So I was not involved in the GROW project, so I'm kind of a commentator from the outside a little bit here. And what I thought I'd do, I'll address the question that Charles just posed, but in the context of some reflections on this kind of 2 directions of causality that I think the GROW project is about, which is, women's empowerment. Can women's empowerment contribute to economic efficiency and growth? And can different growth patterns themselves also contribute to women's economic empowerment, measured through labor force participation and in other ways? And the inequality of opportunity literature that you were referring to, goes back actually to a philosophical literature that goes back, as many things do, to John Rawls, but also to Richard Arnson and Ronald Dworkin and others, and who said, the locus of equity, the place where we should look for equality, is not necessarily equality of incomes, it's equality of opportunity, equality of resources and opportunities, all the different things. And what economists have done, John Romer, Mark Fleury, George van der Gaar and others, was to try and say, okay, if this concept is important of equality and inequality of opportunity, how can we rigorously define it and measure it? And they came up with this idea, and a number of us have worked with it since. Look, the part of it is inequality. I like to call it the inequality as cholesterol analogy. There's bad cholesterol, good cholesterol, and there may be really bad inequality and less bad inequality, let's say. The really bad inequality is the inequality of chances that are due to things people don't control, that are due to race, gender, family background, place of birth, maybe country of birth, if you're thinking internationally. So a whole bunch of circumstances, of which gender is one, okay? And, you know, I could talk at length about that, but the point here for this debate is that there are a couple of papers, one by two Spanish economists, Madero and Rodriguez, in the Journal of Development Economics in 2013, and one by a recent PhD student in France, Jeffrey Tissier, about Brazil. First paper looks at the US, second paper looks at Brazil. Their question is, there was a whole literature out there about inequality and growth. Does more inequality reduce growth? Or does it increase growth? And that literature was inconclusive. You know, whatever you thought, whatever your prior was, there will be a paper that satisfies your prior, that confirms your prior. But then there'll be a paper that rejects that prior as well. And these guys said, well, maybe the reason that we're getting these inconclusive results is that inequality isn't just one thing. You know, maybe it's the bad cholesterol versus the good cholesterol. So what they did is they decomposed US inequality and Brazilian inequality into the parts that were due to differences between, as you said, Charles, people's circumstances. So the inequalities that are due to gender, race, family background, parental education, whatever. And then the other part, which is a kind of a residual, which may include some circumstances we're not measuring, but if not, it's kind of the good cholesterol part, the inequality due to effort, you know. If Fozzer works a lot harder than me, then maybe that inequality between, you know, what she earns and what I earn is going to be good for growth, because it's going to provide incentives for people to work as hard as she does. Okay, and lo and behold, they regressed growth in the U.S. between various censuses and growth in Brazil between various decadal censuses on inequality of income, and they find no relationship. Then they separate out between this good and bad cholesterol, and they find, exactly as expected, that the bad inequality, the inequality of opportunity, significantly reduces growth. Statistically significantly, and economically significantly too. Reduce growth, in at least these two factors. For full disclosure, with some co-authors, I've actually done some work looking at this across countries, and we're not able to find the same result in that paper. But I actually think that's because we're working with much less comparable and less good data when we're looking across countries than they are when they're looking within them. I've already published the paper, so I can say now that you know, I think the results from Brazil and the U.S. are very important. And so this speaks a little bit to this idea that gender inequality as a component of that inequality of opportunity may reduce growth. But there is another paper it's also about the U.S., but I think it's possibly one of the best papers out there on this, which I wanted to tell you about just a moment. It's a paper about Chantal Sieh and co-authors Hurst, Plano, and Jones. I know it as an NPR paper. I don't think it's been published yet, although it was under review at the Econometrics some time ago. But it's a paper about the allocation of talent. And so it's very much the same idea as the inequality of opportunity. The idea is, look, if men and women, and they also look at race, so blacks and whites, have roughly the same distribution of potential talent, right? But they are not, their occupations, the distribution of occupations is not the same. Then we're presumably wasting a lot of talent. Right? So they start with like little anecdotes, like in 1960 in the US, 94% of lawyers and doctors were men. And by 2008, from 94% have come down to 62%. So it's still unequal, but now women are 38% instead of 6%. And they set out through what economists will know as a Roy model, which is a model of occupations in the economy, to try and estimate what part of overall growth in the United States since 1960 might be accounted for by this occupational convergence. Incomplete, partial, but occupational convergence. That is, they don't use that language, but they're effectively trying to quantify the gains from less discrimination and more equality of opportunity between genders and races in the US. And they find that amazingly, that between 15 and 20%, so possibly as high as a fifth of overall economic growth is due to this. And you think of growth, you think of capital investment, technological progress. But it turns out, these very serious guys, in their best estimate, find that just opening up opportunities to women, and in the US case also African Americans, can generate as much as a fifth of the overall US growth in the period. So really a striking result. And with the inequality of opportunity results, I find that these three papers, provide support for some of what the growth people have found as well, in terms of how expanding opportunity to women and other minorities can contribute to growth. Let me spend 2 minutes, if I may, on the other direction of causation. So how does growth reduce, how can growth contribute to women's opportunity? And there again, I work in development, I work with developing countries, almost all of my research is about developing countries, but some of the best evidence on that also comes from the US, it turns out. And in the US, there's a bunch of papers that pinpoint specific mechanisms through which growth, particularly over the 20th century in some cases, or since World War II in other cases, has contributed to labor force participation. They don't necessarily talk female labor force. They don't necessarily talk about empowerment, but if we think of women's participation in the labor force as at least a component, an imperfect, but a component of empowerment, then that has something to do with that. And they point to things like, there's a paper in the Review of Economic Studies by Greenwood and co-authors that identifies causally quite carefully the effect of labor-saving technology at home. So appliances like, labor-saving appliances like vacuum cleaners and washing machines and dishwashers and so on, which go to some of the things that Liz and Ariane were talking about in terms of the double burden of women, and in terms of how these appliances may have lowered the cost of keep running a household, thereby enabling many women to join the labor force. That's one. There's work by Golden and Katz, published in the Journal of Political Economy, about the importance of contraception in family planning. We may not think of that as growth, but in the US context, it was technological progress. It was a new invention that actually, we may think of it as a very important lesson for other countries as well. And I'll come back to Brazil in a moment in that context. But, so that paper finds that the pill, by allowing women to avoid unwanted pregnancies and plan the number and timing of the pregnancies they did, also contributed to a big increase in labor force participation. Probably no news to anyone in this room, but important to remember. Third thing, increase in the services sector. So as the US economy became increasingly more services oriented, this is a sector where the sort of brawn, physical strength advantage of men is less, and therefore also contributed to increasing the demand for women. My personal favorite of the US papers that I'd like to share with you has to do with social norms, which is something that someone mentioned earlier as well, and I think is important. And, I think you mentioned in the question of was it addressed in the context of Pakistan. This is a paper by Raquel Fernandez and two co-authors in the QJE. The final published version is not called this, but the original working paper version is called Marrying Your Mom. And what Raquel and co-authors find in this paper is that men who grew up in households where women work are much more likely to marry women who work. And their interpretation is that there is a progressive breaking of social norms and male preferences that comes through the normalization of women that is mentioned. I think for our context here, this means that, in contexts where those social norms are particularly entrenched and particularly hard to break, that will put a break in the process and needs to be addressed as directly as possible. A number of South Asian contexts, some African contexts, particularly in the Sahel, come to mind in that context as well. So, these were US experiences, but in Brazil, which has also seen a very large increase in women's labor force participation, particularly later than the US, so particularly since 1980s or so, there's a lot of evidence that, again, the spread of family planning, the availability of contraception, increase in women's education, and the provision of childcare, public provision of childcare, particularly in certain municipalities, made a very big contribution to the increase in women's labor force participation. So, from the perspective of, I guess what I tried to give you was a very brief, very selective summary of some of the established economics literature. I was mentioning these journals for those of you who care, because they're big journals. This is high quality research published in top journals. that confirm that in certain cases at least, there is a lot of evidence supporting both directions of causality, from women's empowerment to growth and the other way around. I think the GROW project that people here at the Urban Institute, Arya and others have been involved in, contributes a lot to that by adding a number of developing countries for which we have maybe less evidence of. And as he showed in a graph where he showed the labor force participation stagnating in some cases, there are challenges. Not every place is doing what the US is doing. And then we need to understand why, whether it has to do with those social norms, whether it has to do with the sectoral makeup of the economy, and so on. So I'll stop there. I'll just make a plug, because I think I've spoken for too long, about in the policy arena. So had I had more time, maybe later I'll come back to it. In the policy arena, I wanted to comment on some evidence that we have on two kinds of policies that are direct policies for women's empowerment and labor force participation, on which there is quite a bit of evidence. One of them is to do with safety, which has already been mentioned. So women's safety has direct impacts on their educational and occupational choices, and therefore on the allocation of talent. And the other one is on political reservations, direct quotas and reservations for political empowerment, on which there is some really interesting evidence from India. So we can come back to that if there's time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A very good way to bring us back into a conceptual frame. We've got a few minutes. Fauzia, I'm not sure if this is an enabler or an obstacle, but could you tell us about your work you're doing with marriage registrars, and how you got into that, and what difference? I'm interested in sort of the so what question. You described the bidirectional causal relationship, but the so what question still leaves us with how do you address whether they're the broad rising tide issues of economic growth, et cetera, or the targeted policies.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to do that, but if I could just take a minute to go back to what Francesco was saying about the factors which impact women's empowerment. Of course, it varies from country to country, and we did make a distinction between the United States and Brazil. We found that to be particularly true for Pakistan, and one of the things that we felt mattered was, of course, the lack of women's representation, which could then be addressed through reservation, and it has happened, because about, in my province, 15% of the public sector employment has been reserved for women. There's a quota now. And that has had a significant impact. Along with that, there is also increase in women's decision-making representation. So putting women in boards of public sector organizations, boards and committees both, that has also had a significant impact on how those organizations have started to behave and how they've started to think. Case in point being that I personally was put in a board of an organization which is preoccupied with street crime control, and which implies putting lots of cameras in the streets, about 8,000 for one city, apart from the vehicle-mounted cameras. And when that discussion was happening, it was a very high-level discussion led by the Chief Minister of the province, and that discussion was happening as to how recruitment is going to be done and procurement is going to be done and all. I just asked them how it was going to help capture harassment of women in the streets, because I know that the evidence that the cameras capture can be presented in courts, it stands in court. That single comment, I feel, started to a lot of developments. For example, even development of a women's safety application, a smartphone application where you can report harassment on the street to the police without having to call. It also led to that organization hiring 25% women in a security agency where we have about 2% women only. The other thing is that, sorry, I'm going to come to your question in a bit. The other thing that we found is poor infrastructure in various ways. One, transportation, which is one of the biggest challenges for women's participation in the workforce. And having provision of transport increased and safe transport leads to significant increase of women in employment. Second thing is just basic facilities. For example, having washrooms for women. It may sound very strange to you, but up until 15 years ago, women in the police had to go to a hotel nearby to use the washroom because they did not have washrooms available. And it was only after there was a recognition of this inhibitor that there has been a policy direction towards ensuring washrooms for women every, at least public building, and the private sector then, especially for the large corporate organization, has of course been doing even better, but has started to follow. So having these simple things, or having daycare or crashes in public sector institutions for women, that's led to a significant improvement. And of course, dealing with harassment at the workplace. Having policies and laws in place which deal with workplace harassment, which is a very significant inhibitor for women to join the workforce. We have Ombudsperson's office which deals with harassment at the workplace, and a law which provides for stringent punishment. Coming back to your how evidence gathering has led to any policy direction or intervention, social intervention. So when we started to collect data on women, one of the data sets that we collected was on the registration of marriages and registration of divorces. And we found that the incidence of registration of marriages was low. And it is on the rise, a significant rise. I have a slide I can probably show later. But it is relatively low from what we understand of the quantum of marriage. And we also found that there was an increase in women-led divorces. In Pakistan, we have 3 ways of dissolving a marriage. One is when a man initiates a divorce. The other one is when a woman initiates a divorce. And the third one is when there is a delegated right of divorce given to a woman, whereby she does not lose her dower if she initiates it, which she would have lost if she had initiated the divorce. We also found during the data gathering that we did not know how many marriage registrars there were in Pakistan, and we knew anecdotally, I had experienced that the marriage registrar struck off my right for the delegated right divorce of his own accord, and when I protested against it, and I was perhaps one of those 0.0001% women who actually read the marriage document and protested against it, he got annoyed and he decided to not officiate on this wedding, this marriage, because he felt that what I was doing was un-Islamic. We knew about it, that this is what's happening, but nothing was done really about it. So what do we do then? And this data confirmed that lower marriages being registered, not knowing how many marriage registrars or what their credential was actually leading to disempowering women. So that led to a disempowerment by taking away the delegated right of divorce, by having incomplete information. So a lot of times women can get significant rights in marriage if they are documented. We know that people sign off land at the time of marriage to women. On many occasions we saw that perhaps under pressure women were given benefits in land, etc., property, but it didn't signify whether that property was inherited, or whether it was joint, whether it was single ownership. So there wasn't enough evidence or enough information to actually get access to that property. And that led to that development of this training. First of all, gathering numbers of marriage registrars, which we found was 39,000 men. Although we don't have any barrier to women being marriage registrars in Pakistan, but it's just culture which plays in. So 39,000 men, many of them having very poor education, some of them even blind, who were supposed to fill documents, and little accountability on how they're performing. And we've now undertaken a training, and it's part of government. It's part of a government initiative. Training of all the marriage registrars and all the government officials who end up registering those marriages that the marriage registrars officiate on. It's returning, we've already trained about 22,000 marriage registrars, and it is returning very interesting observations. On the one hand, there are men, marriage registrars, who say, well, who didn't want to talk to me because my head was uncovered when I went to talk to them. But on the other hand, there were so many of them who said, why can't a woman officiate on my behalf? And why is it that we take away the delegated right of divorce if it is not un-Islamic? Because this is also talking about the provisions in Islam. So mixed results, but generally we are taking them as very favorable. But most importantly, it told us they have not been reached out to. And there was a dire need to reach out to this field cadre. And at a large scale. I know that organizations have been doing it before, but it was on a very small scale and the message was not going from the government. So having public sector, government institutions, and the message going for women's empowerment going from those institutions is very important because it gets taken seriously. And now our 22,100 registrars are sort of healing, and they now at least know that there's a liability if they don't register according to the will of old guidance.
And, you know, and I know you're about to collect a whole bunch of data that will
Yes.
fill in some of the down-to-earth information that time is running along, and I want to get help from our audience in pressing questions on the panel. We have microphones that will be passed to you, and when you have a question, if you could tell us who you are, and if you're from an organization, that as well. If you're watching online, and again, it's an email to events@urban.org, and your question will mysteriously find its way to my hand. But let me start on the left side of the room here on the aisle.
Hi, my name is Jenny Gamble. I'm with Discovery Learning Alliance, and thank you all for such interesting data and all really centered around a really important topic. I kind of have a two-part question. It's really for all of you. The first is really around how you're defining women in terms of age. And I say that because we know that so many young women are being forced into early situations where it's 15, and in many of the countries where we see lower economic or lower labor participation rates, we know that there are higher rates of early marriages. And so when you're looking and thinking about how we define women, are you able to capture very young women who are leading households, who are the female head of household who maybe at 15 is pregnant with their second child, and it does have that significant burden of childcare and all of those components. So, around how you're defining women, capturing that sort of adolescent young woman who could benefit from a number of policies. And the second question is really around, and Liz, I think that you had legal parts as enabler, and you're definitely talking about marriage registrars. What kind of relationships did you see between countries and regions where they had strong enforcement of child marriage laws, restricting child marriage and actually having legal consequences against child marriage, and the inverse of higher labor force participation rates? You referenced agency and we talk about social norms, but it seems that kind of the upstream of women's economic empowerment and labor force participation is reducing the effects and prevalence of early enforced marriage. And so can you talk a little bit about the relationship that you may have found between those subjects and if there are any recommendations that came from that?
Can we do this, if you guys can keep track of a couple of questions at a time, and I can collect a couple, but we'll on the end of that same aisle. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Samina Nazir with Networks of Change. Thank you for these presentations. And I wanted to ask Liz, when you were showing the graph of obstacles and enablers, I was thinking, has any research been done on the fact that if women's labor is recognized officially, how does it affect women's self-esteem? Because I've seen in my research work that women who work 16 to 18 hours a day, particularly in rural areas, in agriculture and other fields, when you go and ask them, so what do you do? They answer most of the time is, I don't do anything, I just stay at home. So their labor is not recognized, acknowledged, either in the census or in any other official way, and that strongly impacts their self-esteem. So what can we do to link this recognition with increasing women's self-esteem, how they look at themselves as contributing to the economy, to the household? Thank you.
Maybe we could pause there and deal with these three questions. How do you define women? Do we know anything about the impact of child marriage restrictions? And I assume it's a question about self-esteem, but also women's agency. I don't know if any preferred order.
I think
defining women, for your program, Ariane? How do you-
No, that was a very important question, and we didn't, in the program, we didn't specify that, but we did find in the research, that's not a surprise, is that it is that the point you're making is very, very important. We need to specify that. I think there's, and so there's some papers, and we're happy to point, these might not be published, but point to the evidence that looks at school to work. It focuses on school to work transition, but it's actually much broader than that, and speaks to that topic that really identifies the particular issues of women's economic empowerment for young women. It is particularly in a context of a very tight labour market situation in sub-Saharan Africa. And the kind of findings that come out is one that is the reverse of what you talk about today. But the early employment of young women have a long-term impact negatively overall, right? If women enter the labor market, it means early on, they don't catch up with that later in terms of education, and hence reduces their potential. The other one is in the same research, so this is 6 sub-Saharan African countries that shows how the demographic factors interact with entering the labor force, and early marriage is a very important one in that respect, and that clearly highlights one that we need to know much more about. That, you know, like you say, it's like we need to disaggregate that by age, and with that, you know, particular policy interventions that really work. I don't know how to formulate that, but it's a really important point that needs to work on the interaction of labor demand and supply, like at the same time, basically. And child marriage is an, you know, early marriage is an important aspect of it. Yeah. Oh, yes. Very quickly, just to point you at partly to your second question, and partly some reference to what Francisco was talking about, there's at the moment 2 papers that look specifically at the impact of inequalities and growth, which both come from Stefan Claassen. One looks at cross-country, that looks at institutions using the SIGI index that is produced out of the OECD. I don't know if marriage laws around marriage is part of that. We're happy to point that paper to see what there is on that, and that shows that institutions really matter for growth around gender equality. And the other one, in reference to you talked about kind of that causality from inequality to growth. There is another paper that has reviewed the literature specifically on gender inequality done by Stefan Claassen, and that shows that most important impact, there's actually very little strong evidence yet, apart from in the field of education. There's only rigorous evidence that reducing gender inequality in education, it has a clear impact on growth. All the other indicators with the evidence is still either very weak or mixed. I can point you to both papers.
Please?
Sure. Yeah, I think I want to just briefly echo what Ariane was saying about young women. While there's a huge concern about early marriage, there's also evidence that education of women is increasing, and we see the gap in labor force participation for young women seems to, be larger, and one potential explanation for that is that they're getting more education. So again, it differs by country and so forth, but at least there's some indication when we look at that the education may be driving a slower growth in labor force participation for young women. But let me spend some time addressing the question that was asked over here about women's labor force participation and self-esteem. First thing, one thing that's been found that is kind of the opposite of self-esteem. We've been doing some work on violence against women, and in particular domestic violence, interpersonal violence. And while there's, in the literature, there's not 100% consensus, in our multi-country study, we were finding that when women are in the labor force, they're more likely to experience domestic violence. So that's kind of the opposite of self-esteem. The theories behind that are really theories of males needing to assert power if they aren't doing so well and women are in the labor force and they assert power through violence. So I think that the relationship between labor force participation and interpersonal violence is one that needs to have more studies. In terms of self-esteem itself, I don't know of data that have that measure in large national representative studies, and especially ones that go across different countries. So while we've done some work looking at this question of are you able to participate in this household decision or that household decision? That's not exactly self-esteem. We're using it as a measure of empowerment. But I think that points out an important issue when trying to understand what's going on, and that is the issue of what data are available. And there've been lots of conversations of accountability that the policymakers are, they're told we need to change this, and here is this measure, right? Well, you can only react to measures that exist. So one possibility, and we've had various discussions about that, are to try to develop additional measures so that we can actually hold policymakers accountable to these different kinds of measures. I'm not necessarily arguing that self-esteem would be one, but it's something to think about, the kind of the social psychological kinds of measures are clearly important, as important, I think, I could argue, as the economic measures. So I think that's an important question for the group.
Francisco or Ozzy, any response to these questions?
Sure, just a quick comment on the issue of women's age. So you asked, how we were defining it, just as a factual answer. A lot of the labor force studies in the U.S. and Brazil that I mentioned, it's 18 to 65, in some cases 60 to 65. But on the more substantive point, about the importance of early marriage and early pregnancy, I wanted to point out again some work by colleagues on Malawi, Baird, Osler, and McIntosh, I'm thinking of, but other people, looked at conditional cash transfers, these payments for girls in particular to stay in school. But then they looked at a set of outcomes from that. And what they found, they found many different things, but one thing they found that is germane to this is that one of the things these cash transfers, small cash stipends, which were not conditional on any sexual behavior, they were for school. But by providing some money, which girls would often be getting through kind of sugar daddy relationships otherwise, they actually had a measurable impact on postponing childbirth and, in some cases, marriage. And had it through that an impact on grade schooling. So, clearly, and some of these same authors and other people are now looking at the effect of long-acting contraceptives in Cameroon and other places. So there's really a lot of exciting work, particularly in Africa, on ways of enabling young women to get control of their fertility at that age, with huge implications. And we should also not forget that the evidence from other parts of the world is that two people suffer from very early childbirth, right? The mother and the child. So there's that intergenerational component to that as well. And then if I may just very, very quickly, just something that Fawzia said about street harassment of women and transportation safety. It gives me a plug to refer to one of those papers I wanted to mention by a woman called Giriza Borker, I think, who was a PhD job market candidate this year that we're hiring. She looked at the effect of, there was an app, one of these apps, I think maybe like the one you're mentioning, where women could report lack of safety along various routes. And then she used the fact that Delhi University has, I don't know how many colleges, like 20-something colleges of differing quality spread around Delhi. And what she found is that women who were accepted to better colleges and worse colleges would sometimes, which men would not, would sometimes choose a worse college by the standard rankings if the transportation from their house to the college was safer than elsewhere, which is another direct evidence of misallocation of talent and possible waste of talent for society as a whole through a very direct thing like the lack of safety in transportation.
So To begin with, I agree that most of the data for labor force is where defining women is 18 to 64, right? And that is something that we're addressing by conducting a household survey in Punjab at the district level, where we can get rich data for women between 15 and 64 to capture lots of demographic as well as other information, including age of marriage, education, decision-making, ownership of assets, violence against women, cost of violence, time used, etc. So it's going to bring together a lot of information which hitherto was not present. We have also seen from limited studies in Pakistan that women's employment and income up to a certain level actually leads to greater violence in the home, because when it's low, and 50% of the women in the workforce are earning less than $50 a day, whereas only 8% of the men have the same income, fall in the same income bracket. So we know that up to a certain level, economic empowerment is not necessary. More income does not lead to economic or social empowerment. In fact, it leads to increased violence. But, like Liz was saying, there has been a strong correlation between increased education and delayed age of marriage. And that comes from our demographic and health survey data also, for which then the government has, and I have the slide up, the government has taken specific initiatives, which includes providing scholarships to women. So close to 500,000 women are given significant scholarships to make sure that they are present in school. Or there are other school support programs where food, there will be a nutrition program for students to ensure that they will stay in school. We have skills development trainings also to make sure that they transition more easily into employment for that. But I just wanted to mention the fact that once we have this information from out of 33,000 households, which has disaggregation for gender but also for rural urban areas, we'll be in a better position to understand how all of these factors are woven together. But right now we have a big challenge in terms of child marriage, because child marriage is not reported. And because even though marriages may be documented, it's very easy to lie on people. So in my province, the minimum age of marriage is 16, so it's very easy to lie on the age of the child, the girl, because the marriage registrar often does not have access to the girl, and she only signs, and normally it's her family which takes the marriage document to her. Also, because it is not tied with the national identity card, so it's hard to verify. In the meantime, what can be done, and what is being done, is to have other ways of verification, age verification, which is provide a school certificate or provide a birth certificate at the time of marriage to ensure that she's at least not below 16. And to Samina's question on women's agency and whether increased labor force participation leads to greater agency or validation, I believe that was your question. We don't have any advanced studies on this. But this is also an area that we are examining as to whether increased economic empowerment has led to greater decision making, and that will be one of the markers to understand whether it leads to more esteem or I guess greater participation in decision making is one of the ways of understanding greater esteem for women, self-esteem for women.
Actually, my point was greater recognition of women's economic contribution. Would that lead to self-esteem among women that we are involved in something? Because women do work a lot, but they don't even recognize their own work. So if the governments or other institutions recognize women's labor more, either through census or many other mechanisms, I think that would have a positive impact on women's own, on respect for their own work.
Absolutely, and I'll just pass on to Aryan, but before I do that, I want to mention a particularly problematic area, trend, which is of home-based work for women. In Pakistan, we say, and I know that it's prevalent in other countries of South Asia also, we've got about 12 million home-based workers, of which 80% are women. And that is an extremely punitively exploitative condition that they work in. And I'm sure that recognition or regulation of that sector is going to yield good results for women. Thanks.
Are you going to point? I want to touch more questions.
Very quickly to your to your comment, which is a very important one, and I can give the reference to the study carried out by the consortium led by IDS Sussex, and that has actually data on the percentage of women, and I remember the South Asian context, the percentage of women that says women should be carrying out most of the work in the household. Just like the women are the most conservative in terms of that recognition. And I think it's very important to say like social norms are really, really, really important, and we don't know how these, how we can base it. But also at the same time to say it is very closely related, I believe, to the quality of the jobs, as Fausia is hinting at. The kind of jobs that women do, the kind of jobs that men in those contexts do is really, really poor. Those of women is even poorer and less well paid. So I think there's a clear rationale why women, the moment they can afford it, will actually withdraw from the labor market. Because overall, that is arguably enhancing the well-being of the family, of the women themselves, and in terms of taking care of the children. So it's the quality of jobs in the interaction with social norms, which makes, the point you're making is absolutely pertinent.
Okay, I'd like 3 more quick questions. I'm going to go to this side of the room if there are any. I don't see any in the back. And then in the front, and then here. So we'll in the back first, in the corner.
Thank you, everyone, and this has been really interesting. My name is Rohini Pandey, and I'm working at the World Bank, and in fact, with a group in South Asia, social development, we're doing a series of studies on women's economic empowerment in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, at various stages of development, some with secondary data, and in Pakistan collecting our own data, hoping to coordinate at least with FOSIA. I had a quick question for Liz about your framework for economic empowerment. Would it be possible to pull up that slide? So I understand that you only had a couple of minutes, so maybe you have these things included. But I noticed that you talked about financial inclusion and household assets like land as enablers. But I would actually argue that they're key aspects of economic empowerment and that they should actually be in that middle circle. Otherwise, your middle circle, which says women's economic empowerment, is sort of limited to employment and related factors rather than other aspects of women's avenues to have economic engagement and empowerment, especially in a lot of countries, especially land, and as Fausia showed, financial inclusion are critical measures, I think. And I'm curious about what your thoughts on that. And the second aspect is, we're finding this in our work in Bangladesh, that it's not just a question of working in a productive sector or more secure jobs or having the bank account, but it's a question of who controls that income, who controls that economic opportunity. And I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to add on that.
Good question. Let me go here to the front and then we're running out of time, so if you got a question, correct.
Yes, my name is Nora Magallanes. I'm with AWPC Global. Some of you touched on the fact that there are women who are skilled and trained either as physicians or lawyers but are not participating in the workforce. Can you provide some programmatic recommendations or interventions for us who are on the
Thank you. On the aisle right here.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. First, I think we are talking about evidence-based and data and record. I just wonder, how do you verify those data are meaningful? Because of us, I see you have a lot of women participate in the labor force, but they don't really being recognized about their productivity. Because I try to say is that GDP or employment doesn't mean improve the well-being of our society or our family. And so one thing is that if you have women participate in the labor force, but their family are destroyed. And whether the participation in the labor force even if they are not promoted, whether the society is getting better, do you have an investigation or research on this area, for instance, whether their campaign or processing or campaign against agencies, they say Secretary or Department of Health and Human Services, or whether the social program really benefit the targeted population, or those benefits are just being deprived of. Or even if you are female, get an inheritance, whether in their estate or equipment or savings account will be used for their entrepreneur enterprise purpose, or they will be just victimized. Do you have this type of research?
Thank you very much. How should we answer this?
Yeah, why don't I start with a question about the framework. Yeah, I mean, this framework is very stylized, and in the center circle was really what we were thinking about in terms of standardly measured economic outcomes. But clearly women's entrepreneurship would fit in there as well. And as I think I suggested, that if we're not just strictly talking about economic outcomes, then we really should add some of the more social psychological kind of measures, well-being kinds of things in there as well. And in terms of, in order to achieve that, it is important to have laws that provide access to land and things like that. So I think what you were saying is exactly, we would definitely include those in there. But the last thing you talked about is who controls income, right? And while that could be in part a legal issue, so legally you don't have the right to own your own land, a lot of it is social norms. And I think it is, as we've kind of alluded to here, it's really important to understand how those come about and what kind of potential levers there are to help social norms. And one thing I saw in, one example that I have for that is some of the public social media kinds of things in terms of social norms about violence against women. You know, that's one thing you see to try to teach that. And when we were in a conference in Sri Lanka as part of this initiative, there was a woman parliamentarian from Sri Lanka. And when she was asked that question, she said, we need to start when they're young. When they're children, we need to talk to them about equality, gender equality, and about empowerment of women. I don't know whether that'll work. We need more research on that, but I think that we need to highlight those kinds of issues, perhaps even more than they have been highlighted, and how to address them.
How's
I'm going to address the question related to medical graduates, specifically, or women who acquire education. There are two issues with it. One is one is related to culture, where women are they're going to med school because they'll make better wives, they'll make better brides. So that's a whole different set of interventions that are needed. But on the other side, I've been working on it now. We found that it is the poor infrastructure and the safety of women which prevents them from joining some of the jobs that they are supposed to go to. For example, women are posted to far-flung areas. It's a part of their necessary service in the government. There's no accommodation. And there is a literal threat to their safety from the local landlords and all. And if you put those measures in place, you will get more women into the workplace. And the case in point being Army graduates. Army medical graduates serve in the farthest of areas without any issue because there's a cantonment where all the facilities are there. Even the schools for their children, which is absent. So just having better facilities for women where they work in safe facilities, but also to keep in mind that we are capturing skewed data. While we understand that 50% of the women don't join the workforce among the medical graduates, we are not really looking at the brain drain that happens for men. They get the education and they leave the country, but nobody's measuring that. And here it is where patriarchy sets in. You only measure things that suit the mindset. Just coming back quickly to your question, ma'am, that is why, I agree that GDP is not the sole measure of women's empowerment or anybody's empowerment. Hence, we have indices like the Human Development Index, which goes beyond the growth per capita or the GDP into how they're doing on education, how their health is being measured, how empowerment is generally or representation is being measured. So I wouldn't think that anybody just takes growth in GDP as the index or as the sole indicator of empowerment of any demographic.
Maybe I can say a word about that question too. Basically, I think you asked about the data and so on, but I think basically your question is more labor force participation for women always a good thing, or can there be negative consequences to the families and so on and so forth? And I think that's a good question and one that is asked. To some extent, I think Aryan already mentioned one possible negative consequence, which is if women take on more participation outside the home, but continue to do everything inside the home, then they have no time to rest, they have stress, they have mental and physical health consequences. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at and documented. And presumably many would argue the solution to that is not that women should work less outside the home, is that the work in the home should be better shared. Right? Another point, which is I think one on which there is research, but unfortunately I don't remember the results of the research right now, is the impact particularly when both parents work a lot, of the time spent with children. So there is a lot of evidence that time spent with children, with homework and reading and so on and so forth, have big impacts on children's cognitive and non-cognitive skills. It stands to reason that if people are working all the time outside, think of single mothers in this country or in many other countries, there could be a cost in that dimension. I think this does need to be looked at. It's a contentious issue, but I think it is an important issue, and the consequences for children needs to be addressed.
Thank you. We're running out of time. Are you the last point?
Yeah, I just want to build on what the other panelists said and to come back to the question of programmatic conclusions. And for me, this is, and when at the beginning I said, like one surprise to me in the program was how deep gender, I'm still not sure which of these are good or bad inequalities, but gender inequalities, how deep they are ingrained.
That's a bad inequality.
What's that?
That's a bad one.
But not all gender inequalities are bad. Well, anyway, we'll come back to that. I said I'd be quick, but it's how deeply embedded they are and how often these are not addressed. Some of the research that we talked about was actually on women's economic empowerment programs, and even these did not sufficiently address the double burden of women. So for me, the programmatic conclusion is very much twofold. One, we need to find out what the specific reasons are why, in that case, women graduates don't enter the labor market. Maybe childcare, it may be social norms, it may be rewards in the labor market. That will be different in different contexts, and there's experiments to be done with that in this context. But at the same time, the broader context is important as well. The recognition of women's unpaid work remains important because it informs public finance decisions, for example, through national accounts, not just accounting, but inform issues of public infrastructure. And the point about general infrastructure that is perhaps not targeted to benefit women can have hugely important, the washing machine is the clearest example of that, that reduce the time overall, reduce the time of women, and therefore open up the opportunities. But in the end, if we look at the issue of jobs, it's not just women as well, right? It's the total number of jobs, and as David Lamb said last week, it's like no matter how many RCTs we do on trying to get women into the labor force, given the number of jobs that need to be created, particularly in Africa, this is not going to solve this. The demand of labor, which is men and women, is very important as well, and I strongly feel that we need to address the job opportunities more broadly, and within that, the gender norms.
Unfortunately, we don't have access to this room all day, so we have to wrap up. We could spend the whole afternoon on the so what question. How do we actually enact policies to address these issues? We are scheduled to have what we're calling a networking lunch right now. So I want to explain a little bit about that. We've got a bunch of experts in the room in addition to the 4 people here in the panel. So as we break, I want to point out some of those experts who've been part of our work on women's empowerment here at Irving Institute. And I've made them leave their desks where they're working and come to this room. But I want to introduce Amar Malik on the post there, who's Liz is the principal investigator, but Amar's the one that drives us forward on all the research projects we have and his own work on transport. Yasmin Urban Erickson, who's in our Justice Policy Center in the back of the room, also working on the transport safety and sexual violence issues. Rihanna Raza, who's sitting over here, is on education and workforce participation. And Eddie Moore, back of the room, is a research assistant who really drives the whole thing. The point of the networking lunch is for you to meet other experts and talk to each other. So as we adjourn to 5B, is that right, Ivy? The room next door, that curtain will magically open and reveal a feast. I urge you to, in fact, do that, not just talk to people you know. Find somebody you don't know, introduce yourself. So with that, join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent